Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Okay, so imagine this, right? A fungal infection,
Mhm.
but not just any fungal infection.
Right.
It's like something straight out of a nightmare.
Yeah.
So aggressive, it can just take over and become deadly so fast, especially if you know your body's defenses are already weakened. Or maybe you had like a really severe trauma. And this isn't some, far-fetched movie plot we're talking about.
No,
This is like a real-life terrifying thing called mucormycosis.
it is. It really is a devastating disease.
And
And unfortunately, it's not all that rare either. I mean, here in the U.S., we see about 4,000 cases every year.
yeah.
And when you look globally, those numbers are just staggering, particularly in Southeast Asia and in India, where it's just widespread.
Yeah.
You're talking about 200,000 cases.
And it's so disturbing because we've come so far in, developing therapies that can work with our immune systems,
Yeah.
right, to fight off bacteria and viruses.
Right.
But with fungal infections like this one, it's like we're still so far behind.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it's interesting to think about why that is. I think for a long time, the focus in immunotherapy research has really been on those infections caused by viruses and bacteria.
Right.
And fungi, they're just different. They have this really unique biological makeup, and the ways that they interact with our bodies are just so complex.
Totally.
So it's not that there hasn't been any effort to, come up with effective immunotherapies for something as serious as mucormycosis. It's just that the inherent challenges in dealing with this type of infection have made it really difficult.
Yeah, it's like we're dealing with a whole different kind of beast almost.
In a way, yes.
But that's what makes what we're going to talk about today so exciting, because it seems like things might be starting to change.
Yeah.
And that's why we're doing this deep dive today into a really promising development in the fight against this deadly infection.
It's very promising.
And our focus is going to be on a recent scientific paper that was published in Science Translational Medicine by a team of researchers at the Lundquist Institute for Biomedical Innovation at Harbor-UCLA Medical Center.
Excellent researchers.
Leading this work are two people we should mention: Dr. Ashraf Ibrahim, who's a super experienced investigator who's been studying fungal and bacterial infections for over 30 years and really pioneering new treatments that use the power of the immune system. And Dr. Yu Gu, who's an assistant research scientist who's been at the Institute for the past 8 years and has been doing amazing work in this field.
And what's really impressive about Dr. Ibrahim is his dedication over so many years to really understanding not just how these infections take hold, but how we can actually, help the body's own defenses fight back more effectively.
Right.
And then you have Dr. Gu, who brings, her own unique set of skills and knowledge to the table. And that collaboration between the two of them has been so crucial to this breakthrough.
Absolutely. And this breakthrough is significant because their research centers on using these really targeted laboratory-created antibodies called monoclonal antibodies, which are like tiny guided missiles programmed to zero in on one very specific target.
That's a great analogy.
And they're using this approach to exploit a weakness in the fungi that cause mucormycosis.
Very clever.
And the hope is that this strategy can really boost how well our current antifungal medications work and ultimately, save lives.
That's the goal.
So let's actually get into the study now. What was the main objective that this research team set out to achieve?
So the big goal here was to create a humanized monoclonal antibody, and this antibody would be specifically designed to combat mucormycosis.
Okay.
And the reason for this is pretty clear, right? We desperately need effective immunotherapies to fight this fungal infection because, as we've said, it can be really deadly.
Right. And to do this, they had to find a specific part of the fungus to target, right?
Exactly. They zeroed in on a protein that's found on the surface of the fungal cells. It's called COTH, C-O-T-H.
Okay.
And this protein, it's not just any protein. It's absolutely essential for the fungus to actually invade human cells and start the whole infection process.
So it's like the key that the fungus uses to unlock the door into our cells.
Precisely. A
Yeah.
perfect analogy.
So their first step was to develop an antibody that could block that key from working.
That's right. They started by developing a monoclonal antibody that was derived from mice, and they called it C2.
C2.
Yes. And this initial antibody, it showed some real promise in preclinical studies, which means they tested it in mice, and it was actually effective at protecting the mice that had conditions that were similar to what makes humans vulnerable to mucormycosis, like diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a serious complication of diabetes and neutropenia, which means having a low count of those white blood cells that fight off infection.
Okay, but I'm guessing using an antibody that comes from mice isn't ideal for treating humans, right?
You're right. Using an antibody that's derived from mice directly in humans can cause problems. The human body can see that mouse antibody as something foreign and start attacking it.
Makes sense.
And that's bad news for a couple of reasons. First, it reduces how well the treatment works, and second, it can lead to some pretty nasty side effects.
So what did they do to solve that problem?
Well, they did something pretty amazing called humanization.
Humanization. So they basically gave the mouse antibody a human disguise.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. It involves modifying the mouse antibody genetically to make it much more like a human antibody.
Okay.
And they do this by replacing the parts of the mouse antibody that are most likely to trigger an immune response in humans with the corresponding parts from a human antibody.
So it's like swapping out the parts that scream, "Hey, I'm a mouse."
Precisely. And this significantly reduces the risk of the patient's immune system rejecting the therapy. So it makes it much safer for widespread use and potentially even more effective.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
So this humanization process resulted in a brand new antibody.
Yes, it did. The new antibody is called VX01 VX-01.
VX01.
Yeah.
Got it. And what's really interesting is that VX01 actually became even better at binding to that Koth protein than the original mouse antibody.
Right. It showed about a 10-fold increase in binding affinity.
So it got a human makeover and became even more powerful.
It did. That's right.
Incredible. So they obviously had to test this new humanized antibody, VX01, to see if it really worked.
Of course. And they did that with extensive testing both in the lab, which we call in vitro, and in living organisms, which we call in vivo.
Okay.
And the results were really encouraging. VX01 was just as effective as the original mouse antibody C2 at protecting against mucormycosis. And in some cases, it was actually even better.
So we know that it binds better to the fungus and that it seems to protect against the infection. But how does it actually do that? What's the mechanism behind it?
So the research showed that VX01 primarily works by preventing what we call angioinvasion, ANGIOINVASION.
Angioinvasion.
Yeah, and angioinvasion is basically the process of the fungus invading blood vessels.
Oh, wow.
And this is a really critical step in how mucormycosis progresses and causes so much damage.
I see.
So by blocking this invasion, VX01 actually helps to keep those blood vessels intact and functioning.
Okay.
And this is super important because, as Dr. Ibrahim pointed out, when those blood vessels are damaged, it becomes much harder to get antifungal drugs to the actual site of the infection.
It's like cutting off the supply route.
Exactly. So VX01 isn't just fighting the fungus directly, it's also clearing the way for the drugs we already have to work better.
So it's like a double whammy.
Precisely. It's a very clever indirect approach.
It is. And then there's also the fact that VX01 boosts something called opsonophagocytic killing, which is a mouthful.
It is OPSONOPHAGCYTIC killing.
Okay, opsonophagocytic killing, and what exactly is that?
So basically, it's the process of immune cells engulfing and destroying the fungal cells.
So it's like the immune system's cleanup crew.
That's a good way to think about it. So VX01, it's not only helping to prevent the fungus from spreading, but it's also giving the body's own immune system a boost to fight off the infection.
So it's kind of like a two-pronged attack.
Exactly. It's a very powerful strategy.
That's awesome. But what about safety? Any new treatment, especially for people who are already really vulnerable, needs to be safe.
You are absolutely right. And the good news is that the initial safety results for VX01 are very promising. The researchers found that the antibody didn't seem to have any harmful effects on healthy cells in the lab tests that they did.
That's great.
So this suggests that VX01 has the potential to be a safe treatment option even for people with weakened immune systems who are most at risk from mucormycosis.
That is really good news. This all sounds incredibly promising, but, we always have to be careful not to get ahead of ourselves. What are the potential real-world implications of this research if it actually works out in humans?
Well, the potential impact is huge. As we talked about earlier, mucormycosis is a really devastating disease with very high mortality rates, especially for people with compromised immune systems, like those with poorly managed diabetes, cancer patients, or people who've had organ transplants. So this development could genuinely improve treatment outcomes for these very vulnerable groups of people.
And the fact that it could work alongside the treatments that we already have makes it even more exciting.
Absolutely. Dr. Ibrahim was very clear about that. He said that by stopping the fungal cells from damaging blood vessels, this antibody allows the antifungal drugs that we're already using to actually reach the infected tissues.
Right.
So they can work together for a much more powerful effect.
Yeah, that's a really big deal because, as you mentioned, the number of cases of mucormycosis has actually been increasing, right?
Yeah, that's right. He talked about how there's been a steady increase in cases over the past 4 decades. And that's likely because there are more people with diabetes and cancer, and also because of advances in things like organ transplantation, which can sometimes weaken the immune system.
Right.
So having a new, more effective treatment like VX-01 is becoming even more critical.
And I remember that he also mentioned how this disease often requires really drastic measures like surgery because it's so aggressive.
Yeah, mucormycosis can spread so quickly and cause so much damage to tissues that surgery is often the only option.
Yeah,
And it can be a pretty disfiguring surgery because they have to remove the infected areas.
that's awful.
Yeah, it is. So if a treatment like VXR1 proves to be really effective, it could potentially mean that fewer people would need such extensive surgery. And that would be a huge improvement in terms of quality of life for patients.
Absolutely. So it's all very exciting, but we do need to be realistic about where we are in the process, right?
Oh, absolutely. While these findings from the preclinical studies are really encouraging, we can't forget that this research is still in its early stages. The data we have right now comes mainly from lab studies and experiments that were done using animal models.
So the next step would be to test it in humans.
Exactly. We need further research, especially human clinical trials, to really confirm that VX-01 is safe and that it works in people who actually have mucormycosis.
Makes sense.
The data we have now is very promising, but it needs to be validated in human populations before it can become a standard treatment.
Okay. So it's also always helpful to get some outside perspective on this kind of research. What did the editors of Science Translational Medicine have to say about this particular study?
Well, the editor's summary that they published with the paper is really positive.
Oh, yeah.
They highlight the fact that the researchers successfully translated the original mouse antibody into VX-01, which is now considered a clinical candidate, so it's suitable for testing in humans.
Right?
And they also point out that VX-01 showed comparable or even better protection against mucormycosis in those animal models, and that it might be able to enhance the effectiveness of the antifungal drugs we're already using.
Amazing.
And importantly, they also emphasize the good safety profile that VX-01 has shown so far, which is really encouraging for moving forward with clinical development.
That's great to hear. It's also really valuable to hear directly from the lead researcher, Dr. Ibrahim. What were his thoughts on the significance of this work?
So Dr. Ibrahim emphasized again that mucormycosis is a truly devastating disease, especially for people with weakened immune systems.
Right.
And he explained very clearly how this humanized antibody VX-01 is so important because it helps antifungal drugs actually reach the site of the infection by stopping the fungus from damaging those blood vessels.
Which is huge.
It is. It really underscores just how critical this research is and how much of a positive impact it could have.
So this really feels like a big step forward in a really challenging area of medicine. It's amazing to see how these incredibly targeted antibody therapies, which have been revolutionary in treating other types of diseases, are now being developed to fight these life-threatening fungal infections.
It really is. And it makes you think about the bigger picture. As we learn more and more about the complex relationship between the immune system and fungal infections, what other infectious diseases beyond mucormycosis might we be able to target with these kinds of innovative antibody-based treatments?
That's a great question to consider.
It is. It offers hope for so many vulnerable populations who are facing these really serious health threats.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating and hopeful deep dive into a really important area of research. I'm so glad we got to discuss this today.
Me too. It's really exciting to see this kind of progress being made.
Thanks for joining me.
It was my pleasure.
And for all of you listening out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you then.
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.